Well, the title of the meeting is Revolution in the Air. And so I wanted to actually start by just saying a couple of things about, what that might mean. I think first and most importantly, what it highlights is the incredible potential for change that exists at this moment in history. Because what the revolts and the revolutions in Tunisia and then in Egypt show is that mass action by ordinary people can seem to stop these seemingly unshakable dictators, right? Within a matter of weeks, two powerful pro-American, pro-Western dictators, Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt, were ousted from power. And this just took a couple of weeks. I mean, these guys have been around for 23 years, for 30 years, and so on, and the entry of large number of people into the streets, into the square, and so on, got rid of them. And what this did is that these two revolutions set an example for the rest of the Middle East. And so what we've seen coming off of this is protest movements in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, in Bahrain, Algeria, Morocco, even Oman and Saudi Arabia. And what we're seeing really is what the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky said in another context, and I'll quote him. He said, what we're seeing is the, quote, forcible entrance of the masses into the realm of rulership over their own destiny, end quote. But in conjunction with this sense of optimism and a sense of hope that we're entering a period of revolution, we also have to see these events with a sober eye. And what I mean by that is that it's true that these two dictators are gone, but the armed forces that sustain them, the regime that sustained them, still survives. And this is true in both Tunisia as well as Egypt. The same state bureaucracy, the army, the courts, and the old politicians still remain. In other words, what has been accomplished so far is the first part of a political revolution where much hated dictators have been removed. But we have to keep in mind that this is just the beginning. There still needs to be a process where we can have really far-reaching political as well as economic changes, and there is potential for this, right? So for instance, in Egypt, at the high point of the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, people have seen the images, right, of these demonstrations and so on. One of the slogans at the time is that the army and the people are one, and that's because the army was not attacking the demonstrators. But what we've seen is that since Mubarak has been deposed and the army has taken over, they've actually tried to crack down on protests, and they've passed these really cosmetic changes, which many people are now starting to realize is not enough. It doesn't go far enough. And so what you've seen is over the last few weeks, starting in early April, the demonstrations, particularly on Fridays, which are happening in Tahrir Square, are now pushing for more political change and demanding more from the military. Additionally, over the last few weeks, we've also seen the working classes in Egypt starting to flex their muscles. There have been a series of strikes and other job actions, and there's been a formation of a new organization known as the Workers' Democratic Party. And so all of this holds real potential for the kind of economic demands and changes that are absolutely essential in Egypt. Similarly, in Tunisia this morning, I don't know if people caught the report, but a law has been passed requiring an equal number of male and female candidates to run in the July Constituent Vote Assembly. I mean, this is a step forward for women's rights in Tunisia. So I say all of this really to mark, as I said earlier, the point that this is just the beginning of what's being called the Arab Spring. And I think, again, the words of Marx and Engels is really appropriate in this context. Marx and Engels, I want to quote them from the Communist Manifesto. People may have read the Communist Manifesto. It was written in 1848 on the eve of a wave of revolutions that would sweep Europe. And what they start the Communist Manifesto with, the manifesto being not just a theory and an explanation of what society looked like, but a program for action. And what they start, the first two lines of the Communist Manifesto is a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And I think in this context, we can paraphrase them to say, a specter is haunting the Middle East and North Africa, the specter of revolution. And so there's no doubt that we're entering an era of revolution, and in this context, we do know what we're fighting for, but the question, we do know what we're fighting against, but the question that we have to discuss and debate is what are we fighting for? What do we want as an alternative to the kind of system that we have? So in the time that I have today, I'd like to do three things. I'd like to touch on three aspects, if you will. One, I'd like to lay out a sort of broad snapshot of the revolts and revolutions sweeping North Africa and the Middle East, and address what caused these movements to emerge, why now, and questions of that nature. 2, I'd like to discuss what the attitude of the US has been towards the mass movements. And by the US, I don't mean regular people. Polls have shown that regular people in the majority have actually supported and student solidarity with these movements, but more what has been the attitude of the US government towards these mass movements. And finally, what lessons do these popular movements in the Middle East and North Africa hold for us here, both in terms of the struggles that we have to wage against our own rulers, as well as what is our responsibility in the heart of empire, in the belly of the beast, if you will, to the people who are engaged in these really amazing and brave struggles. So let's start with the snapshot. Okay, so where did this all begin? People may have read about this, but the demonstrations first erupted in Tunisia in the region of Sidi Bouzid. You may have heard of this person, this man by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi. He was a street vendor. He made his living by selling vegetables on the street. And there was one really humiliating incident that he encountered when a state worker confiscated his cart and apparently slapped him in the face and really humiliated him. And in response to this, Bouazizi had just had enough. And so in protest, he set himself on fire and he died 2 weeks later. And what this did is that it became a symbol of everything that was wrong in Tunisian society. And within, a matter of days and weeks, hundreds and then thousands of people took to the streets as a way to, express their frustrations, which had largely sort of lived beneath the surface, if you will. Now, what were some of the grievances? What is it that, made Bouazizi such a symbol of everything that was wrong with Tunisian society? Well, in a nutshell, Ben Ali, the president, is, as I said earlier, pro-West dictator, and he's also been an enthusiastic supporter of neoliberal reforms. As people know, neoliberalism has been the dominant economic logic of capitalism over the last 3 centuries, over the last 3 decades. And part of what this has involved is the privatization of state-owned enterprises. It's involved deregulation and so on and so forth. And Ben Ali really has been quite enthusiastic in passing these reforms in Tunisia. And the upshot of these reforms is incredible wealth concentrated in the hands of a few people at the top of society, with the majority actually seeing that their circumstances had deteriorated. But you can't tell this actually when you look at official reports, right? So you look at World Bank reports, for instance, you see nothing but praise for the economic growth of Tunisia. They claim that poverty reduction was taking place and so on, and they point to the GDP, which indeed has been growing, the gross domestic product and so on. But the fact remains that the GDP actually doesn't tell the whole story of what's happening in an economy and the level of inequality, the level of corruption, and so on and so forth. And to be honest, the level of corruption is astounding in Tunisia. And it's not as if the US didn't know. People may have read the WikiLeaks cable. WikiLeaks, by the way, has done an amazing job of bringing to light things that we know and we suspect happen. But here we have actual proof and documentation that this is how US foreign policy works. And so one particular cable related to Tunisia comes from the US ambassador who was stationed in that country, and here's how he puts it in relation to what's going on there. He says, quote, "President Ben Ali's extended family is often cited as the nexus of Tunisian corruption, often referred to as a quasi-mafia. An oblique mention to the family is enough to indicate which family you mean. Seemingly half of the Tunisian business community can claim a connection to Ben Ali through marriage, and many of these relations are reported to have made most of this lineage. Ben Ali's wife, Leila Ben Ali, and her extended family, the Tbilisis, provoked the greatest ire from Tunisians." And indeed, there's very good reason for this. When eventually the Ben Alis fled and sought refuge in Saudi Arabia, Leila Ben Ali happened to take with her in her luggage 1.5 tons of gold bars, right? Not one gold bar or two, but 1.5 tons of gold bars. So that gives you a sense of the immense corruption and the concentration of wealth at the top of society. And what Bouazizi's suicide did is it really brought to the fore this frustration and this anger at the state of affairs in Tunisian society. And so the Tunisian revolution was just incredible, and it really played a key part in inspiring Egyptians from all walks of life to then show up in the thousands and then in the millions in street protests against their dictator, Hosni Mubarak. But actually, the demonstration on January 25th, which started this whole cascading of events, if you will, it was called well before the Tunisian Revolution, and the activists who call it didn't actually think that it was going to get such a large turnout. But in fact, the example of Tunisia, combined with actually a decade of strikes and demonstrations and so on in Egypt, meant that Egyptians were now ready, if you will, for their Tunisian moment. And really the context in Egypt is pretty much similar to the context in Tunisia for why people went out in such large numbers, risking their lives often in order to see political change. Same context, which is a series of neoliberal reforms in Egypt. It started a little while ago under President Sadat in the 1970s. And again, here's how the mainstream reports on the Egyptian economy. This is from The Economist magazine from July 2010. It says, quote, "The economy as a whole is performing better than ever, largely because the government has at last abandoned its old habits of central planning, state managed capital allocation, high taxes, and price controls. Egypt's share of world trade, which has been falling continuously for 40 years, started expanding as exports tripled in value. Foreign investment gushed in at record levels." So they're, terribly enthusiastic about economic growth in Egypt. And apparently, according to The Economist, all Egyptians are benefiting from this. But if you actually look a little more closely, and again, you can look at government figures from Egypt, what you see is that in the year 2008-2009, poverty increased from 20% to 23.4%. And if you look at where the poverty line is drawn, it's ridiculously low. 40% of Egyptians live on less than $2 a day. So it gives you a sense, of the immense class polarization. Now, in addition to this, unemployment had been rising as well. So that some estimate that the unemployment figure was 26.3%. And the rate for young people, that is people in the age group of 15 to 29, that was 3 times the number. So we're talking about 75 to 80% unemployment among young people. And so that's the upshot. Just like Tunisia, we have crony capitalism in Egypt as well, vast concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. I mean, when the steel industry, for instance, was privatized, it went into the hands of, a person who's associated with the Mubarak family, and he bought it at fire sale prices, laughing all the way to the bank on the profits he was able to make. In the meantime, food prices have gone up to such an extent that people have difficulty making sort of basic food requirements, meeting their basic food requirements. And what you also see in both cases is that actually economic and political demands sort of come together. That is to say, the injustices that people feel at the economic level are reflected with a political face, right? It is these people like Ben Ali, like Mubarak, who are responsible for the economic situation that people are facing. And right, and here's the thing, before January 25th, I just want to say a little bit about, the fact that these things sort of took Western pundits who allegedly know so much about the Middle East and who talk authoritatively about it. Many people had observed some of these, trends over the last decade or so, but there was a tendency to believe that the Egyptian mentality, I'm not making this up, there's an Egyptian mentality to not fight back. And of course, in making these sorts of claims, they're going back to older sort of racist Orientalist views, particularly this notion of Oriental despotism, right? Which it's an idea that was developed in the 18th and 19th century, which basically says that the people of the Middle East and North Africa are really naturally inclined towards dictatorships and despotism and so on, and they don't appreciate things like democracy. In fact, one person from the 19th century, and I'm not making this up, his explanation for this is because of the weather. It's so hot in that region, all these people can do is sit down, lie back, and be governed by dictators and despots and so on. And of course, if these are the views espoused in the 19th century, you can sort of understand it. I mean, I don't understand it, but you can at least say, okay, fine, that was 2 centuries ago. But I know if people caught an interview with Bernard Lewis, who is this Orientalist ideologue, if you will. He's 94, but he still thinks he has useful things to say. Never did, but continues to think so. In this interview, he still believes that Western-style democracy in the Middle East would be, in his words, a disaster. Anyway, nothing could be further from the truth. Not only have Egyptians been fighting back against dictatorship and against their economic conditions, but they showed in January just how much power ordinary people have in their own hands. Just to give you a sense of some of the precursors to the January uprising, through the course of the 2000s, for instance, people were involved, for instance, in solidarity struggles with the Second Intifada that broke out in 2000, right? The Palestinian struggle against their conditions. There also emerged a democracy movement that rallied a large number of opposition groups under the slogan of Kifaya, or enough. Also, textile workers, particularly in the Mahalla region and elsewhere, had been waging strikes. And it's so inspiring to see some of the footage from this and see women who are in full burqa actually being some of the leaders of these movements, sort of dragging the men behind them. And of course, that's not what we're led to believe about Muslim women. We're told that they're victims, they have no agency, and of course nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, if you haven't seen this already, I was going to show some footage, but I didn't have time in my presentation, but one of the videos that sort of went viral on YouTube was made by this woman, Asma Mahfouz, young, I want to say 23, 24-year-old, wearing a hijab, and speaking so impassionedly about the need for people to come out and actually oppose Mubarak. And that video actually went viral. Many, many people saw it and came out onto the streets. So some of the key people leading these demonstrations actually have been women. And I think it's really done a lot to sort of, cut against the kind of sexist and racist view that we have of Arab and Muslim women. At any rate, the culmination of all of these struggles and movements unfolded with the January 25th movement. And in a matter of 18 days, Mubarak had to step down. He stepped down on February 12th. So what was a Tunisian movement became an Egyptian movement. And keep in mind that Egypt is actually very significant in the region. In many ways, if you look back at history, it's acted as sort of a harbinger of things to come. And indeed, that's exactly what it was. It really inspired people around the region. And it's not just in the region, right? I mean, this was around the world. At the same time, we were seeing the demonstrations and the struggles against the union-busting attempts of Scott Walker in Wisconsin-Madison. And I don't know if people saw some of the picket signs, but people were drawing the connections, right? There were people who were carrying picket signs saying Hosni Walker, sort of drawing the parallels between Scott Walker and Hosni Mubarak. And of course, that makes sense, isn't it? Because the same neoliberal logic that has created immiseration in Egypt is exactly what's being carried out here by our erstwhile leaders. But in the Middle East, of course, the impact is just incredible. So in fact, I was just looking through, The Guardian has this really good timeline. If you want to sort of get a sense of what's been happening when, just Google Guardian, Arab revolutions and timeline, and it gives you a good sense of what's been happening at what point. And you look at that map, and there's not even a single country in the region that has not in some way been affected by the two revolutions earlier this year. In Iran even, in fact, the Green Movement, people may know that the Green Movement emerged in response to the rigged elections of 2009. It's been really interesting to hear Iranian activists actually talk about the ways in which Egypt and Tunisia and so on has re-inspired them to go out and revive the Green Movement. In Iraq, there have been strikes as well as mass demonstrations. This is across the board: Algeria, Morocco, Jordan, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And but the most sustained struggles really have taken place in Bahrain, Yemen, Libya, and now Syria. And I want to spend a little time talking about Syria because this week has been incredible in terms of the events unfolding in Syria. Let's start at the beginning. What happened in Syria to start this series of strikes and struggles and so on? It actually starts in the city of Daraa. On March 6th, 15 young boys, really teenagers, young boys, inspired by what's going on in Egypt and in Tunisia, decide to make some graffiti. They write some graffiti on a wall. It's anti-government. They say the people want to topple the regime. But of course, this is too much for the al-Assad regime. And so these kids, really the kids, they were imprisoned and they were tortured. I mean, their fingernails were extracted from their fingers. That's what was done to kids. And of course, the families of these people were livid. They marched to demand justice, and they were shot at by the police, right? And so the brutality and the sheer callousness with which these people were treated for simply being inspired by what's happened around them was just too much. And what you see is, in a matter of weeks, hundreds and then thousands of people came out onto the streets. And we're talking about, actually this morning I saw a report on Al Jazeera which said that there's not a single major city in Syria that has not seen struggle erupting, right? We're talking about Daraa, Homs, Damascus, Aleppo, and so on and so forth. And in each of these uprisings, what you see is that people have not only been inspired by each other, but they've also learned lessons from each other in terms of what to do and how to make their local struggles successful. So for instance, in Bahrain, Pearl Square in Manama became a symbolic space, just like Tahrir Square in Cairo. And over the last few days in the city of Homs in Syria, Clock Square has become the center of many protests. And I was watching BBC, and one of the demonstrators said, we've renamed it Tahrir Square, right? So you get a sense of how people are learning from one another and trying to generalize the lessons in the process. But it's not just regular people who are drawing the lessons, so are the people who run these various societies. And it's not surprising that one of their first responses is to turn to brutality and violence as a way to suppress these movements. Over the last few months, what you've seen is they've gone between, on the one hand, granting some limited reforms, and on the other hand, using really the most brutal repression that you can find. And of course, it's not surprising that they would resort to violence, right? After all, it's worked for them before. Why shouldn't they use it now? I mean, think about it. Logically speaking, if you have ruled as a dictator for 2 decades, 3 decades, in the case of Gaddafi, 4 decades, how do you do it? You do it by making sure that no challenge against you ever sees the light of day, and if it does, it gets drowned mercilessly in blood. Let me give some examples. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, which, as people may know, it's ruled by the Al Saud family, also one of the longest allies of the United States in the region. The relationship, of course, between the US and Saudi Arabia is oil for security. You give us the oil, and the US would give Saudi Arabia security, meaning to say arms, military training, and so on and so forth. And security against what? Not just external threats, but internal threats. And what does that mean? That means every struggle for democracy, every struggle against the ruling monarchy has been squashed. In fact, I'll come back to this later. The specific examples of how this works. And this is true not just of the monarchies like, Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Morocco and so on. It's true even of the republics like Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and so forth. Iraq, for instance, people know this from our mainstream media. When Saddam turned from an ally into an enemy, suddenly we heard about torture chambers. Suddenly we heard about the gassing of the Kurds and so on. Of course, absent from all of this is that the US supported, gave chemical weapons technology to Saddam Hussein, and very much approved of what he was doing. And the last example I'll give is Syria. And the current president, Bashar al-Assad, his father, actually put down a rebellion against him in 1982 in the city of Hana, where the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist organization, had organized an uprising, and he literally drenched it in blood. The estimates are between 10 and 30,000 people were killed in that city. And obviously it wasn't just the Muslim Brotherhood, it was regular people as well, and it worked. The Muslim Brotherhood pretty much disappeared for at least a decade or so as a political opposition force to Assad. Now, what we've seen is that since March, in country after country, the state has been using violence to quell the protest movements. The most dramatic of which, of course, the beginning point was Bahrain, right? When Bahrain, with the help of troops from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, went and went on a rampage against the people in Pearl Square. You may know this because Nicholas Kristof, he writes op-ed pieces for the New York Times, happened to be there, and he's just so shocked and horrified that this is going on around him. And actually, we've seen this not just in Bahrain, but in Libya, when Gaddafi starts attacking the rebels who go up against him, in Yemen, in Syria, and so on and so forth. But even though this has been going on now for a little over a month, what we've seen is that despite this brutal repression, the struggle continues. And one of the statements, the reason for this is that if you watch the interviews with the activists, one of the statements that you hear again and again is, we have lost our fear, right? We have nothing to lose, we have lost our fear. And when you hear that, and when you hear that people are no longer scared of state repression, this repression is not going to work. It's really the beginning of the end. And what you've seen in country after country is that the government will use repression, people get killed, and then the next day there's a funeral march. And what started as perhaps a couple of hundred people now gets galvanized into a couple of thousand people, because everyone is so angry at the fact that some people had to lose their lives for conditions that all of them hate, that all of them abhor. So in other words, this violence and this repression hasn't been working, and the rulers are realizing that they can no longer continue to hold power and continue to rule in the old way. And this is really how the Russian revolutionary Lenin put it. He said a revolution happens when two conditions are met. One, the rulers cannot rule in the old way, and two, people stop consenting to being ruled in the old way. And that's really what you're seeing this week in Syria. You saw a couple of weeks ago in Tunisia, in Egypt, and so on. Now, the flip side of this is that the rulers have realized that just violence alone won't do. And so they've granted some reforms, right? I'll give you some examples. In Yemen, the President Saleh increased wages, he reduced income taxes, he ordered the creation of a fund to employ university graduates, reduce tuition, extend social security, and so on and so forth. In Algeria, the president promised to lift a 19-year-old state of emergency, and he's enhanced subsidies for basic food and necessities and so forth. In Jordan, after a couple of days of protests, King Abdullah basically dismissed his cabinet and he appointed a new one. Similarly, Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah promised $36 billion to address inflation, housing, social security, education, unemployment, and so on and so forth. And the same is true of Syria. Assad sacked the governor of Daraa, right? Remember the story I told you of the 15 boys who were tortured and so on. Eventually, the governor of that city got sacked. He's also done a number of things like released 260 prisoners, lifted emergency laws, created a new cabinet, etc., etc. But despite all of this, the daily struggle has continued in Syria, because people are fighting for nothing less than their dignity, right? They are fighting for self-rule, they're fighting for autonomy, they're fighting for freedom from repression, they're fighting for genuine democracy, and really an end to one-party states, right? The need to have genuine political representation. So what's the upshot of all of this? Essentially, the rulers of all of these countries are caught in a situation where on the one hand, they've learned the lessons from Egypt and Tunisia, which is rearrange the deck chairs, get rid of the Ben Alis, get rid of the Mubaraks, and for a time at least, the mass character of these struggles can be brought under control, and the old regime could continue to rule. So that's one lesson that they're seeing, and they're granting reforms. But at the same time, with every concession comes greater demands. So they've fallen back, needless to say, to tried and tested methods of repression, violence, imprisonment, and torture. So really, this is a very dynamic situation. It's hard to predict what's going to happen, and we're going to have to see in the months and the years ahead how the situation is going to be resolved. And of course, a lot depends on the organizations and the organized forces involved, their politics, the strategy and tactics that they use, and so on. And by that, what I mean is that the presence of an organized left, really, a left that understands the lessons of history, that has tried these lessons out in practice, that's gained valuable experience from organizing, the role that they play is going to be crucial, because what's needed for full-scale transformation of any society is not simply mass action, that's important, but you also need a program and a plan of action and what needs to happen next. And that's the part that the left can play and is playing, actually. All right, so the second part of what I wanted to talk about is what role has the US played in this Arab Spring, as it were. I hesitate to use the word Arab Spring, even though that's the word that's been used, because Iran, has been active, since 2009. Iranian people have also been active. But anyway, what has the US done? How has the US responded to this? Now, before I say what specifically the US government has said in relation to Egypt or in relation to Syria and so on, I think it's useful to sort of step back and look at US foreign policy. And by the way, this policy cuts through Democrat, Republican, and so on over the last 50 years. That is, from World War II, what has been the attitude of the US to various countries and regimes in the Middle East? Well, fundamentally, if you had to boil it down, it comes to three letters: oil, right? It's about securing oil, not so much for domestic consumption, but because oil is a vital resource that makes the world economy run. And so for the US, control over those oil resources has been crucial. And needless to say, any ruler who goes against these interests of the US is seen as a threat. So for instance, in 1953, when the democratically elected president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, had the audacity to actually nationalize the oil industry, the US simply couldn't have it. The CIA launched a coup known as Operation Ajax and toppled him and replaced him with a dictator, the Shah. I mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier and the repressive methods. Well, around this time, the late 40s, the early 50s, going on to the mid 50s, oil workers actually in the eastern oil-rich provinces were mobilizing for their own interests. They were striking and so on and so forth. And the role that the US played via Aramco, people may know Aramco, the Arab American Oil Corporation. What Aramco did is basically provide the names of the leaders and of the organizers so that the Saudi US-trained military and police forces could crack down on them, imprison them, deport them, torture them, and otherwise silence this sort of resistance. In other words, any threat to the oil order that the US wanted to impose was one that was opposed by the United States. And by the way, this doesn't just have to do with oil-producing countries. It also has to do with countries that through which oil flows, that is, countries that hold key gateways for the transport of oil. And I mean, to be quite honest, the US actually has very little tolerance for real democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. And it's not surprising why this would be the case. A poll that was conducted by the Brookings Institution, not exactly a left-wing institution, it conducted this poll in relation to what people think about Iran and whether people in the Arab world see Iran as a threat and so on. So a poll was done of a number of Arab nations, and what they found is when asked, who do you see as the biggest threat to your interests, 88% identified Israel, and 77% identified the US, and a mere 10% actually saw Iran as a threat to their interests. And so there's good reason for the US to fear genuine democracy coming up in any of these countries. Because if they did, if you had real political parties, it's very likely that these political parties would go up against the agenda, the US-Israeli agenda in the region, and of course the US is not going to stand for that. And in fact, the only kind of democracy that the US does approve of is the kind of, toothless, putative democracy that we see in Iraq, where essentially a client regime rules with the backing of tens of thousands of US soldiers who still are in that country. So with that background, now let's look at how the US has responded to Egypt, to Syria, and elsewhere. It should come as no surprise that there hasn't been, enthusiasm coming from the halls of the policy circles. This is how Hillary Clinton put it on January 25th. She said, quote, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable and is looking for ways to respond to the legitimate needs and interests of the Egyptian people." Okay? In other words, miscalculation, obviously. They thought that Mubarak could sort of ride this process out, And the approach that the US took is we will stick with our dictator for as long as possible, and when it looks that he's really not going to last terribly long, we'll throw him overboard and we'll make these sort of gestures, these putative gestures towards reform, towards the people's movements and so on. And really the kind of change that we've seen in Egypt is exactly what the US wants. You know, the military has put in some cosmetic changes, and the US, of course, can live with that. In the case of Libya and Syria, it's slightly different. These are two countries which, along with Iran, have at least in name opposed US imperialism in the region. Yet at various points, by the way, they've also worked with the US. And I won't go into examples, I'll just talk about Libya. Gaddafi, of course, as we know, anyone who has any sort of historic memory knows how much Gaddafi is reviled in the US context. But keep in mind, of course, that he was brought into the Western fold over the last decade or so. He even became an ally in the US war on terror, and of course he was rewarded with vast military aid, which, by the way, it is those very same arms that he's using to go after and to attack the people who stood up against him. So when the Libyan uprising emerged, the West actually saw this as an opportunity to get rid of this really unsavory character who's always been sort of a thorn, and to put in place a more pliable leadership that they can actually control. And really for the US as well, this was a way in which they could save face in light of the disasters in Iraq and Afghanistan and sort of don the mantle of humanitarianism, right? This is going to be a humanitarian war. We're going off to rescue poor people, innocent people, and so forth. And so we have to be really clear. The US has never done that, and it's unlikely to do that in one or two instances. And the real reasons have to do with their national interests. In Syria, what has been the response? Despite the brutal repression of the Assad regime, the US has actually been hesitant to speak out strongly against it. And by the way, that's true of Bahrain as well, right? I mean, people know that the Fifth Fleet is stationed in Bahrain. If the US wanted to stop the repression, it didn't have to send anyone. Just use the Fifth Fleet. But of course they don't want to do that because they want to maintain the oil for security relationship. But in the case of Syria, the US again has been somewhat reluctant to condemn the violence, and that's because its two closest allies in the region, Saudi Arabia and Israel, actually prefer to work with what they call the enemy we know, rather than face the uncertainty of what a democratic reform movement might bring to power, right? What kind of people might actually come to power. And in fact, actually earlier this week, I don't know if people caught this, but it was revealed that the US has been supporting some opposition groups in Syria. The WikiLeaks, again, we have to thank WikiLeaks for making this available. And one of the outfits that's being sponsored by the US is Barada TV, which is a London-based satellite channel that broadcasts anti-Assad and anti-government news into Syria. And the editor is the co-founder of a Syrian exile group called the Movement for Justice and Development. Now, I want to say a couple of things about this. First, I think this is a classic example of how the US government operates. Work with the dictator, to the extent possible, but also try to replace that dictator with a more pliable leadership, right? Cultivate these so-called democratic groups, that's the front, that's the name that's given, to replace this person. And this is really standard operating policy, so much so, if you've seen the interview with government spokespersons, right, they would challenge, oh my God, the US is sponsoring all these opposition groups and so on, and their response is to say, yep, we do this kind of thing, this is normal. So that is really a classic example of how the US operates. Two, I think what we should not do is draw the conclusion from this that the Syrian uprising is the creation of the US. This is by no means the case. As Bassam Haddad, who's written about this and who's a professor at George Mason, who's given a bunch of interviews at Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera and so on, has shown very clearly, the opposition groups that the US actually supports are just not seen as credible among the opposition forces in Syria. And furthermore, the democracy movement in Syria is really a genuine grassroots struggle, and it would be such an insult to somehow see this as machination of the United States. And I'm saying this specifically because this was the mistake that some sections of the left made in relation to Iran. where people saw the Green Movement as somehow being engineered by the United States. And really, this is such a slap in the face to the genuine aspirations of people both in Iran as well as Syria. The final thing I want to say about this is this movement for justice and development, this exile group that's based in London that the US is backing. I actually don't know anything about this group. The first time I came across them is when I read the WikiLeaks document. And from what I've read, they are a moderate Islamist party. Now, many of you might be startled. They're a moderate Islamist party, is that right? Well, this should come as no surprise to anyone, especially, again, if you have a long view. What you've seen is that over the last 5 decades, the US has backed Islamist parties as a bulwark against secular nationalist and leftist organizations. And so that it's supporting a moderate Islamist party in Syria shouldn't be surprising. It's simply a continuation of old policy. And by the way, it also appears that the US is not terribly opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in Egypt. I don't know if you've caught this, but ever since, about February, March or so, several talking heads on television have sort of gone out of their way to demonstrate that the Muslim Brotherhood is not like Al-Qaeda. They're a moderate Islamist party. They're just like the AKP in Turkey and so on and so forth. And as we know, the AKP in Turkey is pro-neoliberal, pro-NATO, and so on and so forth. So I think what we're seeing is the ground being laid for a distinction between the jihadists, against whom, of course, a war on terror must continue to be waged, and the moderate Islamists with whom the US can work, because they could still potentially support the same kind of agenda. All right, so what does all this mean for us? I need to come to a close fairly soon. Well, first and foremost, we have to unequivocally support the demands of ordinary people in their struggles in the Middle East and in North Africa, and we have to reject US meddling of any sort. So that's the first and most important thing, is we have to have a sense of international solidarity with our brothers and sisters in that region. But in addition to this, I think we have some useful lessons right here for us in the United States. Some of you I was talking to, you came off seeing an announcement in the city newspaper with the meeting titled Revolution in the Air. Others have seen posters, what have you. And that sounds fascinating as a concept, but when we look around us in Rochester, there isn't a revolution in the air. There needs to be one, but there isn't a revolution. So let me step back and say why I think there's a connection between what's going on in North Africa and the Middle East and what I think can happen right here in the United States. The United States, the conditions in the United States, very similar to those in other parts of the world. We too have seen a massive class polarization over the last 3 decades. In fact, over the last 30 years, the bottom 80% of Americans have seen their wages either stagnate or decline. And the wealth of not just the top 10%, it's not the top 10%, and it's not even the top 1%, but the top 0.1% have become fantastically wealthy, right? We've seen the birth of a new era of robber barons, if you will. I don't know if you've come across this book. It's by a Wall Street Journal reporter called Richistan. Right, the word stan, as in Afghanistan, Pakistan, means place, and Richistan is the place and the culture of rich people in the United States. It's really worth a read to see what kind of lifestyles these people live. I'll just give you one example from it. They drink this drink called Martini on the Rock, which costs $10,000. Why? Because there's a diamond in it. You think about that for a second. There are people who don't earn $10,000 in an entire year. And yet these fabulously wealthy people have so much money that they need to spend $10,000 on a drink to amuse themselves, right? So that's the situation that we have in the United States. And you add to that, the fact that unemployment has been going up, continues to, stay quite high. The demand on food pantries is going up in the United States. Bankruptcy is increasing as a result, not just of people losing their homes and their jobs, but also due to healthcare related bills. And actually this morning, I don't know if people read the New York Times, but there was a poll that said that 72% of people polled actually think that we should end the Bush era tax cuts, right? And tax the rich. There's a number of polls have shown that people actually want to tax the rich as a way to balance the budget. The same poll in the Times this morning said that both parties actually have pathetic public approval ratings. 75% of respondents actually disapproved of the way Congress is handling its job. So in other words, what we do have, even right here in the United States, is anger at the state of society, anger at the political and the economic system. But it's hard to predict when this anger is actually going to turn into action, when it's actually going to explode in the form of the protests that we've seen in the Middle East and North Africa. And so I want to use, again, some words from Marx to try to make sense of this. And here's how Marx puts it. He says, quote, "It is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of a natural science." So we can tell that the conditions are horrible, class polarization is growing and so on and so forth. So we need to distinguish between the conditions and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men and women, I would add, become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. In other words, when do people say enough is enough? When do people have their Bouazizi moment? Or when do people have their Egyptian moment, or what have you? That is really hard to predict. And so the reason why the bulk of this meeting really has focused on the examples of North Africa and the Middle East is to say that people will fight back, and that what we need to do is get ready and be prepared for when this fight back arises to actually take the struggle forward. And to be honest, in the United States, we do have formal democracy. We have, two parties and so on and so forth. But what does that actually mean? We have two parties that are pro-capitalist, that get their money from pretty much the same sources. And so what do we do every 4 years? We throw one set of bums out and replace them with another, and they pretty much do whatever it is that they want, and that is to actually advance the agenda of the people who give them the money, which is the business community. So in a way, honestly, we're fighting for democracy even right here in this country. We also have to fight against the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a minority, and instead demand a society based on social, political, and economic equality. And that kind of system has a name. It's called socialism. And I want to argue that socialist politics and Marxist politics actually makes complete sense in light of the chaos that is happening around the world, in light of the chaos that neoliberal capitalism and the wars waged by the United States, the kind of situation that it's created for the vast majority of people. I started by quoting from the Communist Manifesto of 1848, and I want to end by saying that we need a socialist manifesto for our times today. And I think that manifesto is going to be written like people, by people like this, in rooms like this, or people like those who demonstrated in Madison, or so on. We need a vision for a different kind of society, and we need to dedicate our time and our effort to fighting for that kind of society. And I'll just end by saying it's a struggle that's absolutely worth it. So, thank you.